Yeah, it all started, we understand, in conversations as early as '56 in chambers of PG&E, but the first inkling of it was in '58 that they wanted to build a power plant out here, not necessarily a nuclear power plant. And they bought the land probably in '61. They condemned it and bought it. About '62 or '63, they announced it would be nuclear. And in that heyday, they also said eventually we're going to go from 300,000 kilowatts to 1,000,000, 3 different plants. And the president of PG&E said eventually we'll have 10 nuclear power plants on the coast of California. I thought I'd go through this history by going from one activist character to the next to kind of explain what really happened. And just to explain myself, to begin with, as I told you, I was born and raised in Petaluma, and our folks used to bring us out here once in a while to the coastline. Petaluma, a little city of 6,000 people, and what a treat that was to be on the coast of Sonoma County. I've been devoted to it ever since. But it also imbued my sister and my brother with the real treasure of this coastline. And at the time of this battle, I was just getting started with a veterinary practice here in Cotati, and I was developing carefully one dairyman after another to be my client. And when I learned of a possible nuclear reactor out here, I did a little research, and they talked about the great spill at Windscale in England, where they shut down the milk supply for 5 or 10 weeks, so you couldn't produce milk out of that area. And I could just see that disaster affecting Sonoma County without an accident, because a nuclear power plant, it does put iodine-131 into the air, and it settles on our pastures. Cows eat the grass, produce milk, it concentrates in the milk. Milk is consumed mainly in much greater quantities by young people, and it deposits in the thyroid glands. And if the housewife of the Bay Area learned that that milk had even the threat of that, it would have ruined our dairy industry. So I combined that with my love of the coast, and as my brother says, why do we have to industrialize the coast of Sonoma County for this plant, was my background in participating in the battle. Peripheral at best, but probably some important things I did. But let's just look at where we are right now. The edge of this hole is 1,000 feet from the edge of the San Andreas Fault. One of the largest earthquake faults in the world. And in 2006, it lurched 25 feet one way. The Hopkins Marine Lab did a survey on the bay south of here over to the tip of Point Reyes, right on top of the San Andreas Fault, and found an upwelling of 95 feet from previous earthquakes. So you can see that if a nuclear plant was built here, it could be really tossed around when the San Andreas kicked up its heels. The Atomic Energy Commission, of course, said that a nuclear plant can't be built within a quarter of a mile, 1,300 feet. And so their original idea was to put it up at Horseshoe Cove, but that was less than 1,000 feet. And PG&E kind of lied to the AEC in saying we're a quarter of a mile. It wasn't, it was less than a quarter of a mile. They built the Humboldt plant as a pilot plant, and they were going to duplicate it down here. Well, first of all, they didn't make these so-called cladding processes around the nuclear material out of the proper material, and it was giving off so much iodine-131 they made them shut it down and reclad it. And then later on, local geologists up there found an earthquake fault very close to the plant. So AEC said, look, you're contaminating anyway with iodine-131, and you got to shut down. And they shut it down. They made it into a steam plant. But they could have done that same thing by duplicating it, produce that process right here. And we charged them time and time again, well, what about the iodine-131? And they said, well, we'll kill jackrabbits every month and see if they have anything in their thyroids and monitor it that way. And so privately, I got a veterinary colleague up at Eureka to get one of his clients to slaughter a cow, and we had the thyroids rushed down to UC, and they were full of iodine-131. And here they had a schoolhouse just downwind from that plant up there. And those kids were walking home having been exposed to iodine-131. They were very careless about that. They didn't think it was that important. That's a very dangerous thing to have around. Iodine-131 has one redeeming feature. It's gone, or its half-life is only 30 days. Whereas the strontium, which will also come out of the plant, it lasts forever. It's not to be played with. As a veterinarian at school, they just essentially scared the life out of us about the dangers of radiation and showed us all these horror pictures of what it did to human tissue and so on, animal tissue. So I came out just breathing properly indoctrinated against radiation, no matter what, in what form. Earthquakes are unpredictable, as we all know, now reading the papers in the past 6 weeks. And in a way, those few activists that were around at that time were exonerated by what we see in Japan right now when you have an accident. I think, as I say, I'd like to kind of go through this on the basis of the people involved. And I want to explain the political climate of Sonoma County at the time that this whole battle took place. And there was a supervisor known as Nin Gadati who represented this area. And he was a very powerful guy. He ruled the roost. One time somebody approached Nin and said, don't you think we ought to have a county manager? And he said, no, we don't need a county manager. I manage it from my book here in my breast pocket, type of attitude. Well, when PG&E moved into town, that represented maybe 25-30% increase in our assessed valuation. So everybody fell in line, including Nin Gadati. So PG&E, using their power of the purse, you might say, got the Board of Supervisors, mainly Nin Gadati, first of all, to not hold a public hearing and allow PG&E to build power lines across Doran Park from this site without a public hearing, nobody able to protest, and he just ruled that way. Then he told the Harbor Commission that had been set up to manage the harbor that there's a planned road in front of the waterfront over there to abandon that and allow the road to be built out here along the tidelands to be used for PG&E to put the tailings from this hole in the head. And Clem Miller, the congressman, local congressman, said, look, we have to get the Army Corps of Engineers to approve of this. Army Corps said you have to have a public hearing. That was the first time the public out here had a chance to really complain about the nuclear power plant. Otherwise, there's no place for citizens to turn with a supervisor in that position. And kind of a summation of that whole thing was to have Governor Brown, when it approached by it, say, well, I'm for it, but it's not up to me, it's up to the Board of Supervisors. So there's no place for the citizenry to turn. And the Board of Supervisors met secretly with PG&E beforehand, and Gadati arranged that the plant was okay with no public hearing. And so when the group got together to fight this thing, they fought that lack of a public hearing through local courts all the way to the Supreme Court of California, and were turned down at every turn that a public hearing was not necessary. You can imagine that in this day and age. Then Gadati is quite a character. One person described being with him down at the tides and walking through the fish market, and then would pick up a salmon and walk out with it, no word spoken. Type of arrogance in that process. So the locals were very concerned. Rose Gaffney, who owned this headland, other than its very southern part, really put up a fuss. She'd write letters to the editor, and she'd sign her daughter's name to it. Pretty soon the Press Democrat told her, well, no more letters, you can't do that. And she was dealing, of course, with the state park system that had almost enough funding to buy this, her land, and also with Berkeley UC chancellors to sell the Horseshoe Cove for a marine laboratory. And by the time it was all over, PG&E used its real power in this state to tell the state park people that they couldn't have it. PG&E was going to go out here and condemn it. And UC Berkeley backed off. So that was an example of the power that PG&E had in those days to get what they wanted. They had a full-time man working with Jack Prather, the head of planning. Jack liked his drinking, and they go out every night and drink their booze, and made sure that Prather allowed all these things to happen, including the road, where in those hearings on the road, a local fisherman said, look, if you dump those tailings along that shoreline, it's just going to ooze the mud out into the middle of the bay and ruin our harbor. And the Corps of Engineers said, no, that won't happen. But sure enough, that's exactly what happened after they built that road. So in the middle of all this, Joe Hedgepath, who headed the Marine Lab for College of Pacific, wrote letter after letter to the president of PG&E, and finally wrote the first letter that appeared in the Press Democrat, really condemning the idea that this would be a power plant. He's very concerned about the warm water, where they pick up the cold water here, run it through the plant to cool it, dump it out in the ocean so it could cool. what that would do to the organisms along the coast. He pleaded with the president of PG&E that he'd like to do a baseline study, take them 4 years before they let that happen. And Joel was a real fighter all the way through this thing, and a huge help with his scientific expertise. And then we had a local columnist in the Argus Courier in Petaluma that wrote a column on Petaluma history, and he had a wonderful time just poking holes in PG&E, and he had a real ability to write and make PG&E look so foolish. So my brother Carl, good friend of the history aspect of Ed Mannion, picked up on that, and about that time, Harold Gilliam, who was the environmental writer for the Chronicle and would write almost weekly columns in This World section of the Chronicle, wrote a really very well-studied description of what PG&E had done to Sonoma County in getting this permit, and the damage it would do, and for the first time described not just the fact that industrialization take place, but to lose this beautiful head to industrialization. And for the first time described the fact that California really wasn't prepared to take on something like this. It needed some overseeing entity, a commission or otherwise, to look over the coast of California. That was the first hint that we needed a California Coastal Commission. So Carl read Gilliam's article. He knew Gilliam, and it really stirred his passion, and so he came up here with his family, and he walked way out on Bodega Head and met Rose Gaffney and talked to Joel Hedgepath and other activists out here who weren't really getting very far, and went back home. And he's a good writer, and he actually spent a whole weekend writing a letter to the editor of the San Francisco Chronicle, and I have it here in this book, if any of you want to read it. And he took it into his friend Scott Newhall, who was the editor of the Chronicle at that time. They had previous connections. And Scott had been very helpful in helping Carl set up the Maritime Museum. And Scott essentially said, wow, and didn't tell Carl whether he'd print it or not. And it took up all the letter to the editor space in the San Francisco Chronicle. And Scott let it go, put it in, and left town for 3 days because he knew what his editors would do. Because, you know, the Chronicle and PG&E were very tight. San Francisco and PG&E were very tight, and you didn't dare stick your neck out against PG&E. Well, that caused such a stir, that letter. Never underestimate the power of a letter to the editor. That in that letter, Carl in his final line said, pick up your pen and write a letter to the State Public Utilities Commission and have them reopen the hearings on building a nuclear power plant at Bodega Head. Because they had had a hearing, nobody paid any attention to them, and they had already given PG&E the go-ahead to do this plant. They got 2,500 letters from that letter to the editor. And the PUC did open up their hearings again. And sure, they were very biased, and the hearings didn't get anywhere, but they really got publicity. And that kind of launched the whole effort by people in general to be against the building of this plant out here. In the meantime, my small contribution was David Pessinen was a forestry student, and he had come to those hearings, and he really got inspired. He was representing, I think, a committee on the Sierra Club on conservation, and he really got into it. He put 4 years of his life into this thing and ran a splendid campaign to defeat his plan. And he had written a paper on a visit to an atomic park in paper form. And so I took that paper and got my old friend Jim Steer, who was a colleague of mine in veterinary school, who had worked at one time for Ernie Joyner, who was the editor of the Sebastopol Time. Joyner had quite a reputation. He's a far-right kind of guy. He's the only editor in west of the Mississippi who predicted Harry Truman would win. He described having a bullet hole in the front window of his newspaper office as an indicator that he wasn't always liked in his little town in the Middle West. Came out here and bought the Sebastopol Times with the idea he's going to buy all the weekly newspapers surrounding the Press Democrat and do them in. And so Jim introduced me to Ernie, and boy, he just grabbed that paper of Pessinen's and said, I'll do something with this. So the main thing he did was to put it in type, so then Pessinen could get it published in a booklet, and that was widely distributed. But Joyner put that in front page of his newspaper, 3 weeks running, headlines, and gave great legitimacy to the battle here locally, because the battle was pretty much fought outside of Sonoma County. And Joyner lost 40% of his advertising, to give you an idea of what a powerful thing PG&E was at that time. In the meantime, there was enough publicity from the public hearings, the reopening of the public hearings, and that a group was then formed known as the Californians to Protect Bodega Head and Harbor, and they met in a meeting of about 6 of them, and included Nealon's chemistry professor from Berkeley, and my brother Carl, and Harold Gilliam, and Hedgepath, and 2 or 3 others. And Carl described it as feeling like you were in a little cell during wartime Europe, where you were organizing the resistance to a major power. It was a real uphill fight that these people had in front of them to defeat this thing. The other thing I did was I just started a veterinary practice there in Cotati, and was concerned about my dairymen, and reading that, Lou Waters, who was the father of West Coast Jazz, lived just across the street. And so he came over, and we had long talks about what could be done about this site out here. He's an amateur geologist and had left a trumpet in a suitcase for 10 years. And then he went back to think about what he could do. And he picked up his trumpet for the first time in 10 years. And his wife suggested that they ought to release balloons from the head here and let them float down over the Bay Area where the wind would go. And so that was all put together, and there's a great gathering out here, and Blue Waters wrote the famous song Blues Over Bodega, and and they had Barbara Dane out here, famous jazz singer, and it got a lot of publicity, but the real publicity was that these balloons kept dropping down in parts of the Bay Area, and every time one came down, they'd get a big blast of publicity about how this thing was going to work. And then there was Hazel Mitchell, who is very active here, but her main function was she was a waitress at the local Tides restaurant, and these PG&E types would be in there conspiring how they're going to do this thing, and she'd overhear all this very good scuttlebutt that we needed to make the thing work. So anyway, back to Scott Newhall. He lived in Berkeley, and he came over every day to work at the Chronicle, and he flipped on the radio one day, and there was Barbara Dane singing blues over Bodega, and he was a great jazz fan. And so when he got back to the office, he called Carl and said, "You won." Because when you have a battle like that and the public starts to pay attention and the musicians of the world start to make music around it, you're a long way towards victory. And Scott recognized that, basically. So about this time, I'm kind of skipping back and forth on the time thing, but the organization to preserve Bodega Head Harbor wanted to do something right here in Sonoma County. And so they rented the Oddfellow Halls in Santa Rosa, and we're going to talk, got a little publicity, talk a little bit about the use of nuclear power and the dangers of nuclear power. And they had quite a crowd. Some estimate that 200 or 300. And Dave Pessonnet put it all together and got experts in to talk about what happened up in Idaho when one of those reactors went bad up there, and talked about wind scale, and what do you do with this stuff once you've used it, and where are you going to store it, and so on and so forth. And Governor Brown had sent his full-time person that was to promote the peaceful use of the atom in California. And his name was Colonel, I have the name there someplace. Huh? Grendon. Always nice to have a wife. And Grendon kept his mouth shut, and about towards the end of the evening, he really opened up, and he spoke to this audience from the back of the room. He said, "You people have no business being here. You don't know anything about the nuclear energy. You have no," essentially saying you don't belong here. And it really angered that crowd. And KPFA was recording it, and they picked up that anger, and they picked up this kind of top-down, go away attitude, and then they broadcast that in the Bay Area. And then they sent a copy of the tape down to their sister station in Los Angeles, and a world-famous geologist known as Pierre Saint-Amand, who had a very high-level position as a geologist with the U.S. Navy, and you didn't question him on his opinion, was out in his Jeep in the middle of the desert and picked up this station and heard Grendon talking like this, and it made him so mad that when he got back in town, he called up Pessonnet and said, "Anything I can do to help?" And that was a real breakthrough for Pessonnet, because yeah, he said, come on up and see what's out here. Well, in the meantime, PG&E had started to excavate for this power plant. They said, well, this is not a building permit. This is just getting ready for putting a building on it. And AEC said we could do this. And the Board of Supervisors, through all the yelling we did, I didn't so much, but, you know, where's your building permit? So the Board of Supervisors changed temporary interim zoning on the headland here, because it was designated to be a state park, to agriculture. And agriculture doesn't have to have a building permit to build a building. So that's the way they got around this, to let PG&E build a nuclear power plant. And so anyway, St. Amand came up here, and Doris Sloan, who was a young mother in Sebastopol and neighbor of Hedgepath, she got pretty excited about this whole battle, and went on to become a professor at Cal in geology, a very effective woman. Pessenden couldn't make it, so Doris brought St. Amand out here. And there's nobody here, all this equipment around and no gates, ladders down in 30 feet down into this hole. And St. Amand and Doris climbed down the ladders, and sure enough, there's a branch in the San Andreas Fault right in the bottom of the pit, or on the walls of the pit. So he had enough prestige to make a fuss about it. And PG&E immediately hired 2 geologists from UC and said, no, St. Amand is wrong, and tried to get around this. And but the word was out there. Meantime, Harold Gilliam had been hired by Udall, who was Secretary of Interior, to write a book about interior. And so Harold took that position, and that gave him entree to Udall, and he said, look, you ought to look at that battle out there in California, and get your geologists to confirm the Sierra St. Amand findings. And they did. And those 2 geologists from San Mateo, their top geologists, came out here and spent weeks studying that fault that St. Amand had found, and came back and told Udall that it's unsuitable for a site. Well, PG&E found out about that and said, okay, we'll redesign it so we can handle that thing. We'll go another 75 feet down to solid bedrock. Well, solid bedrock wasn't there. This thing had shifted north. Bodega had, over millions of years, you might say, up the coast of California, clear from Point Conception. You can imagine this body of land, Pacific Plate, that's the American plate over there, going along our coastline and breaking up as it did. And those geologists also went down and studied the fault that the earthquake of '06 on Point Reyes, and found rocks that had cracked way beyond 1,000 feet from the San Andreas Fault from that earthquake at that time. They had a very solid cave. And so AEC was furious with this other Department of Interior, fooling in their business. And so they allowed PG&E to redesign things. They had all kinds of ideas. engineer from Caltech said, well, we'll put it on ball bearings, type of engineering arrogance. And then just about that time, the Alaska earthquake took place. And AEC could see those chunks of land depressing in some places and rising in other, and it really made him behave. But they were still fighting it. And in the meantime, Jean Kortum, Carl's wife, who had real political connections in San Francisco, had built the political case. We weren't getting anywhere with local politics. She realized it had to be done at state and national level. And through her Democratic Club connections in San Francisco, got the state CDC to come out against the nuclear power plant. And that made the politicians wake up in Sacramento, and Claire Engel came down on our side, the senator at that time. Pat Brown was still against it, and she got the state Democratic Central Committee to come out against it, Roger Kent, and then she got the Assembly to come out against it, state legislature. Didn't have any luck with the state Senate. They turned around and voted how wonderful the pilot plant up at Eureka was, and endorsed that. So she didn't have both houses. But she created a climate, a political climate. And finally, Pat Brown himself came out against the plant. And that was a huge breakthrough, because we have a theory, and we haven't been able to prove that yet, that those two institutions at the federal level, here you had Interior arguing with AEC, and AEC trying to promote the atom, that somebody had to get between them and make a decision. And we feel that probably LBJ, through a phone call or otherwise, said, shut it down. And he did that because Gene had created this California climate. You could even imagine Pat Brown calling LBJ and say, why don't you do something about it? Anyway, that was the final decision, and PG&E pulled out. They stuck $3 million in this thing, and they gave it back to the state for $1, and here we are.